Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest lecture in the Technology and Future of Medicine course. Tonight's lecture is entitled Evil as a Treatable Disease. And in essence, it's a critique of Simon Baron-Cohen's book, The Science of Evil. I thought I would reflect a little bit on this general area. So we're talking today about evil and empathy, but there are other ways to kind of conceptualize the same thing. In Scientific American, just 2 days ago, there was another way described, looking at selfishness and selflessness. Now, people have assumed for a long time that human evolution is basically selfish, and that what we're producing as we evolve is increasingly selfish beings. But this study of the population of Binghamton, New York, a small town very close to where I grew up. I actually grew up in Avoca, New York, and an even smaller town. And so Binghamton is the center of this research on selflessness and selfishness, and they discovered that selflessness is also evolving, and so there's a positive side to human evolution. It's a very interesting article, not just because it comes from a place close to where I grew up. Now, as Earl is going to tell us later on, evil is cultural. And so it doesn't seem to be an absolute. No matter how strongly we may feel about evil, the fact is that what is evil in one culture may be good in, or be regarded as good in another culture. And unfortunately, perhaps this is particularly true in the area of women's rights and rules for women. Which are remarkably different in various cultures. In a very broad sense that we're discussing in this course, that really matters. It matters for a lot of reasons, but one is that we need to capture nuance and subtlety. And this other article from this week's Scientific American says that women are much better at capturing nuance and subtlety than men on average. So if we lose the female voice, we lose quite a lot. Now you can think of a kind of hierarchy, though, when you think of robots and people. If women are better than men at nuance, right now robots are inferior to both men and women. And we have a lot of concern about whether robots will ever have, emotions, will ever really care about us, and so on. But the singularity is about a time when machines are actually smarter than we are, and you would imagine that the things we won't be able to follow, the things that the unaugmented human being won't be able to figure out, after this occurs, where robots and machines are smarter than we are, will be exactly in this area of nuance and subtlety. So at that time, maybe machines will be better than any humans in this area of nuance and subtlety. Is the singularity inherently evil? We're talking a lot about evil tonight. And so how would you feel if something impacted on your life, basically controlled your life, that you could not communicate with? I think that you had no input because you couldn't figure out why the decisions were being made or how to influence those. It seems to me that's almost the sort of definition of evil, and yet that's exactly what we're talking about happening at the time that the singularity occurs. So is there a solution? Well, you may say, well, no, Kim, there actually is no solution, and that's why we're here. We're talking about a situation we can't predict and how, but I think I would argue that, in a sense, education is the answer, or the best answer that we have. And no matter what the exact challenge will be at this time when machines are smarter than we are, it's probably best if we speculate, discuss, and envision scenarios. And that is, in essence, what this course is all about. So that's almost all I had to say before Earl's lecture begins, but there was one other part. Now, the book that he's talking about is constructed, I think, in a proper marketing sort of way, where if you pick it up and just open it up in a logical place, you hit something that appeals to you enough that you might actually buy the book. So the last paragraph of the book that Earl is reviewing reads like this: empathy is the universal solvent. Any problems immersed in empathy become soluble. It is effective as a way of anticipating and resolving interpersonal problems, whether this is a natural conflict, an international conflict, a problem at work, difficulties in a friendship, political deadlocks, a family dispute, or a problem with a neighbor. Now, that's pretty broad. Empathy, he's saying, will handle all those things magically. I hope you have been persuaded that this resource is a better way to resolve problems than the alternatives, such as guns and laws and religion. And unlike the arms industry, which costs millions of dollars to maintain, or the prison industry and legal systems, which cost millions of dollars to keep oiled, empathy is free. And unlike religion, empathy cannot, by definition, oppress anyone. And that's the way the book ends. Now, I think that this is not necessarily true, but it's a part of the book that Earl was not prepared to read to you.
So let me tell you a little bit about why I'm here and why Kim thinks that I can contribute to our mutual agony as we try to figure out what happens to the technological future. As I read this book, I thought back to when I was a boy in a one-room school in Ontario, and we lived in a very small village. We lived about a quarter of a mile down the road, and about a mile down the road were three boys that I went to school with. Billy Fluter, to put it in the vernacular, was a bugger. He had it in for me. He was a farmer's son. He was strong. He was tough, and he thought I was a nerd and an absolute wimp. And so on the way home, he would prove this as often as he could by beating me and pummeling me and leaving me in the ditch. So I came to believe in my youthful mind that Billy Fluter was evil incarnate. And so I encountered evil very early. And I grew up in a very, I would call it religious, Christian religious home in which evil was often cited as one of the problems in the world. And so I had the language and the narration that provided me with an identification for Billy Fluter. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Because every time that Billy Fluter beat me up, I would go home and I would tell my mother, you know, I wish that guy were dead. He's absolutely evil. As far as I'm concerned, I'd like to see him dead. 2 weeks later, he was. He and his family were on their way to church in Hamilton, and they went up over the rise of the hill, and a car was passing, and there was a head-on collision, and Billy Fluter went right through the windshield, and that was the end of Billy Fluter. Well, that wasn't the end of it for me, and I think you can see the problem that I had to face then, because the school, of course, had a memorial service, and the school had to remember Billy Fluter. And I was torn. On the one hand, I didn't know whether I had some kind of magic that said, well, you know, Billy Fluter, I want Billy Fluter dead, and it happened. And that kind of threw me into a loop. And then on the other hand, I had to admit that I kind of felt sorry for him. That, you know, if in fact I had had something to do with doing him in, that I really hadn't meant it that way. That really all I wanted him to do was to get a broken arm or something so he couldn't beat me up. That's about all I wanted to do. But so when I used the kind of murder language and all that stuff, it was more, you know, breast pounding and that kind of stuff. But that wasn't the end of it then, because you see, even though I felt empathetic, we had to meet with the parents. And the parents were devastated, obviously, right? I mean, a son like this you don't get very often. And here was two people whose world had just collapsed. And I felt complicit. I tell you this story because when I read what Simon had to say, I didn't know whether he was speaking tongue-in-cheek or whether this was a genuine piece of work. Because, you see, empathy is not something that you can just find sitting alone by itself. Nor do I think you find evil sitting alone by itself, that you can, you know, hone in on it. Now, I know we always use Hitler and the Holocaust and things like that as primary examples of evil. But, you know, there are people who even see Hitler in some kind of context. And when you do that kind of thing, then you see how messy this whole area becomes. So when I see the science of evil, the first thing I think of is, well, I don't believe this at all. I just don't believe it. So you have to understand that I'm coming at this book with a big, huge gob of doubt, right from the word go, because my own experience of empathy and evil is a rather convoluted and difficult one. And so to argue that you can move from one thing into the other is, you know, for me, just a bit much. Okay. So let's go into his book. What I've got on my slides, more or less, is his argument, because I want you to have his argument so that you can register that and figure out what you think of it. So here are, for him, the 4 kinds of conditions in people which exhibit a lack of empathy. So from psychopathy, narcissism,